Part 1. December, 1943. Royal Air Force Fighter Station, Southern England. The cold morning air hung over the airfield as mechanics removed the protective covers from an aircraft unlike anything most British pilots had ever seen. Its nose stretched farther than a Spitfire's. Its wings appeared strangely thin. Its polished metal skin reflected the pale winter sunlight while the famous Rolls-Royce Merlin engine remained silent, waiting for its first mission under Royal Air Force colors. One by one, experienced fighter pilots walked toward the unfamiliar machine. Most had survived years of war. They had fought over Britain, crossed the English Channel countless times, and watched close friends disappear into clouds, never to return. They believed they already knew what a great fighter looked like. Within the next few hours, almost every one of them would change their mind. What none of these men realized was that their first flight in the American-built P-51 Mustang would permanently alter how they thought about air combat. Some would later describe it as the easiest fighter they had ever flown. Others admitted they had never expected an American aircraft to outperform Britain's finest designs. But nearly all agreed on one thing. The first few minutes inside the Mustang's cockpit felt like stepping several years into the future. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become a contest of endurance. Allied bombers crossed the continent almost every day, striking factories, railways, and fuel depots deep inside occupied territory. Yet, every mission carried a terrible cost. German fighters waited patiently. They rarely attacked immediately after takeoff. Instead, they allowed bomber formations to travel farther inland before launching coordinated assaults, knowing that Allied escort fighters often lacked the fuel to follow. For years, this had been one of Germany's greatest advantages. British Spitfires were exceptional fighters, admired around the world for their agility and climb rate. But they simply could not remain over enemy territory long enough. Eventually they had to turn back toward England, leaving the bombers alone. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where that invisible boundary existed. German pilots even joked about it. If they waited long enough, the escorts would disappear. Then the bombers would belong to them. Entire formations suffered devastating losses because no fighter possessed the combination of speed, altitude, and range necessary to stay with them all the way to their targets. The search for that aircraft became one of the greatest priorities of the Allied war effort. Ironically, the answer arrived from an airplane that few people had initially taken seriously. The original Mustang had never been intended to become one of history's greatest fighters. When the aircraft first appeared, it impressed engineers with its clean, aerodynamic shape and remarkable fuel efficiency. Yet its early engine struggled at high altitude, exactly where modern air combat usually occurred. Some British test pilots admired its handling. Others considered it an interesting aircraft with limited potential. One evaluation concluded that the airplane performed beautifully at lower levels but lost much of its strength above the clouds where German fighters preferred to engage. For a brief moment, it seemed destined to become little more than a reconnaissance aircraft. Then someone proposed an extraordinary experiment. Instead of redesigning the entire airplane, why not replace its engine? The decision sounded almost absurd. Install Britain's powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine inside an American airframe. No one could guarantee success. The engine bay required extensive modification. Cooling systems needed redesigning. Engineers worried about balance, airflow, vibration, and reliability. If they failed, months of work would produce nothing more than an expensive disappointment. If they succeeded, they might create something aviation had never seen before. The first test flights stunned everyone involved. The new Mustang climbed faster, accelerated harder, reached higher altitudes with ease, maintained remarkable speed while consuming surprisingly little fuel. Pilots who expected only modest improvements returned wearing expressions of disbelief. Some simply climbed out of the cockpit, removed their flying helmet, and quietly shook their heads. One engineer reportedly asked whether something had gone wrong during the flight. The pilot smiled. No. It went far better than anyone expected. Soon afterward, the Royal Air Force received several Merlin-powered Mustangs for operational evaluation. Among the first volunteers were experienced fighter pilots who had accumulated hundreds of combat hours. These men were not easily impressed. They had flown hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. They knew every strength and weakness of the Spitfire. Some had tested captured German fighters. They approached the American aircraft with cautious curiosity rather than excitement. Flight Lieutenant David Fairbanks climbed onto the wing before lowering himself into the cockpit. Everything appeared both familiar and strangely different. The seating position felt comfortable. The controls seemed naturally placed beneath his hands. Visibility over the nose remained limited while taxiing, but once airborne, pilots would later discover that the bubble canopy offered extraordinary views in almost every direction. Ground crews finished their final checks. The Merlin engine burst into life with a deep mechanical growl that sounded unmistakably British despite powering an American fighter. The entire aircraft vibrated gently. Oil pressure climbed. Temperatures stabilized. The signal arrived. Takeoff cleared. Fairbanks eased the throttle forward. The Mustang began rolling. Acceleration increased almost immediately. Pilots accustomed to earlier fighters noticed how smoothly the aircraft gathered speed. There was no feeling of struggling against invisible resistance. Instead, the airplane seemed eager to fly. Within moments, the wheels left the runway. The aircraft climbed steadily into the gray English sky. Almost instantly, something felt different. The controls remained light. The aircraft responded without hesitation. Small movements produced smooth corrections instead of abrupt reactions. Pilots often described the experience as though the airplane anticipated their intentions before they fully moved the controls. As altitude increased, the Merlin engine continued delivering power with remarkable consistency. Many fighters became sluggish as they climbed. The Mustang seemed almost indifferent. Higher, higher, still climbing. Fairbanks later admitted that he kept expecting the aircraft to reveal some hidden weakness. It never did. He leveled the fighter before gently banking left. The Mustang rolled effortlessly. He pulled into a climbing turn. Again, the aircraft responded without complaint. Then he pushed the throttle farther forward. The landscape below blurred. Villages, rivers, and fields merged into streaks of winter color. The airspeed indicator continued rising. Most pilots instinctively glanced around the cockpit during those first moments, searching for signs that such speed must surely come with increased vibration or instability. Instead, the airplane remained astonishingly calm. Several Royal Air Force pilots later remembered the same unexpected impression. The faster the Mustang flew, the more stable it seemed to become. That characteristic inspired confidence almost immediately. Confidence mattered more than most civilians could imagine. Air combat rarely rewarded hesitation. A pilot who doubted his aircraft often lost precious seconds deciding whether it could perform a dangerous maneuver. Those seconds frequently determined who survived. The Mustang eliminated many of those doubts during the very first flight. Soon, more evaluation pilots returned from similar sorties. Their reports displayed an unusual level of agreement. The aircraft accelerated exceptionally well. Its high-altitude performance exceeded expectations. Long flights caused less fatigue because the controls remained balanced. Most importantly, the enormous internal fuel capacity promised something every escort pilot desperately wanted: time. Not just a few additional minutes. Hours. Hours that could keep bombers protected far beyond the limits of previous fighters. That single advantage changed every conversation inside Royal Air Force briefing rooms. For years, commanders had planned missions around fighter endurance. Now they could begin planning around fighter capability instead. The difference seemed subtle. In reality, it would reshape the air war over Europe. The Mustang had not yet proven itself in combat. That moment still lay ahead. But among the pilots who climbed out after those first evaluation flights, a quiet realization was already spreading across the airfield. They were no longer asking whether the American fighter was good enough. They were asking how quickly they could receive more of them. Part 2. Word of the Mustang spread through Royal Air Force fighter stations faster than official reports ever could. Pilots trusted paperwork only so much. They trusted other pilots far more. In squadron mess halls, conversations began changing. Men who had just completed evaluation flights sat quietly with cups of tea, while younger pilots surrounded them with questions. Is it really that fast? Does it actually climb better than a Spitfire? Can it really escort bombers all the way into Germany? The answers were surprisingly simple. Wait until you fly one. That response appeared again and again. Not because the Mustang was perfect, but because describing it with words seemed almost impossible. Every experienced fighter pilot carried certain expectations whenever climbing into a new aircraft. There would always be compromises. More speed usually meant heavier controls. Greater fuel capacity often reduced maneuverability. Better range typically came with lower climb performance. The Mustang refused to follow those rules. Its designers had somehow combined qualities that rarely existed together. It was fast without feeling unstable. Powerful without becoming difficult to control. Comfortable enough for hours of flying, yet aggressive enough to fight some of Germany's finest aircraft. As more Royal Air Force squadrons converted to the new fighter, training flights quickly became confidence-building exercises. Pilots practiced steep climbs, high-speed dives, tight turns, emergency recoveries, engine failure procedures, long-distance navigation. Again and again, instructors noticed something unusual. New Mustang pilots reached operational confidence much faster than expected. The aircraft inspired trust. That trust became one of its greatest weapons. Every pilot knew that fear consumed valuable attention. If you worried constantly about your own aircraft, you spent less time watching the enemy. The Mustang allowed its pilots to focus outside the cockpit instead of inside it. That advantage would soon prove invaluable. The first operational escort missions revealed something bomber crews noticed almost immediately. For the first time, the escort fighters were still there. Hour after hour, silver Mustangs remained above the bomber formations. German observers struggled to understand what had changed. Previous Allied fighters usually disappeared somewhere near the German border. Now the escorts stayed. They crossed rivers, rail junctions, industrial cities, oil fields, deep into the heart of occupied Europe. Luftwaffe commanders had built years of experience around predictable Allied behavior. Their attack plans depended upon bombers eventually becoming isolated. Suddenly, those calculations no longer worked. Everywhere they expected defenseless bombers, they found Mustangs waiting. Royal Air Force pilots quickly developed enormous respect for the aircraft's endurance. Long escort missions tested not only machines but also human concentration. Hours inside a cramped cockpit could exhaust even experienced airmen. Cold temperatures numbed fingers. Constant engine vibration created fatigue. The endless scanning of empty skies strained every muscle in the neck. Then, without warning, enemy fighters could appear from any direction. Pilots had only seconds to react. The Mustang made those demanding missions easier than anyone expected. Its cockpit layout reduced unnecessary workload. The controls remained responsive even after several hours in the air. The Merlin engine continued running with reassuring smoothness. Many pilots later recalled listening to that engine during long flights. Its steady rhythm became strangely comforting. As long as the Merlin continued singing, they believed the aircraft would bring them home. One squadron leader later explained that flying the Mustang felt less like wrestling with a machine and more like working alongside a trusted partner. That confidence spread rapidly. Soon, combat reports began arriving. One escort mission over northern Germany demonstrated exactly why the Mustang had become so dangerous. Bomber formations approached their target under clear skies. Everything appeared quiet. Almost too quiet. Experienced pilots recognized the warning signs immediately. German fighters were waiting. Moments later, dozens of Messerschmitts descended from above, attempting their familiar high-speed attack. Previously, bomber crews would have faced those assaults almost alone. Not anymore. Mustangs climbed to intercept before the German fighters completed their dive. The engagement developed in seconds. Aircraft scattered across the sky. Contrails twisted through the freezing air. Machine guns flashed. Engines roared at maximum power. For many Royal Air Force pilots, this became their first real opportunity to test the Mustang against the Luftwaffe. Several admitted afterward that they had entered combat with cautious optimism. By the end of the battle, caution had become admiration. The Mustang accelerated out of turns more quickly than many expected. When German pilots attempted to dive away, the American fighter followed without hesitation. Its laminar flow wing remained remarkably stable during high-speed descents. Its Merlin engine continued producing tremendous power even at extreme altitude. Perhaps most importantly, the aircraft recovered smoothly from aggressive maneuvers. That forgiveness allowed pilots to remain focused on fighting rather than simply surviving. Veteran airmen often described aerial combat as a continuous chain of decisions. Every choice carried consequences. Climb or dive. Turn left or right. Attack or disengage. The Mustang expanded those choices. Pilots discovered they possessed options unavailable in earlier aircraft. They could pursue longer. Escape faster. Remain above enemy territory with enough fuel to fight and still return safely. Every additional option increased survival. German pilots noticed the difference almost immediately. Reports reaching Luftwaffe headquarters described an unfamiliar problem. The new Allied escort fighters refused to leave. Even after failed attacks, Mustangs regrouped quickly and continued protecting the bombers. Repeated interception attempts became increasingly costly. Some German pilots initially underestimated the aircraft simply because it had American origins. Many believed British fighters remained the greater threat. That opinion rarely survived the first encounter. Captured intelligence later suggested that experienced Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned to respect the Mustang's strengths. They understood it possessed exceptional speed, excellent high-altitude performance, and enough range to appear almost anywhere. Royal Air Force pilots developed their own opinions just as quickly. Many still loved the Spitfire. Nothing could replace its legendary reputation. Its graceful handling remained unmatched in certain situations. Yet conversations inside squadron headquarters began changing. When missions required absolute maneuverability, many still preferred the Spitfire. When missions demanded victory over hundreds of miles, the answer became almost unanimous. Take the Mustang. One experienced pilot summarized the difference perfectly. The Spitfire wins your heart. The Mustang wins the war. Whether every pilot agreed with those exact words hardly mattered. The feeling behind them spread across the Royal Air Force. The aircraft offered something no previous escort fighter had delivered. Freedom. Freedom to chase enemy aircraft instead of constantly watching the fuel gauge. Freedom to protect bombers from takeoff until they crossed the English coast again. Freedom to dictate combat instead of merely reacting to it. Mechanics admired the Mustang for different reasons. Ground crews spent countless hours maintaining fighters between missions. Every additional sortie depended upon their skill. Compared with several earlier aircraft, the Mustang proved surprisingly practical. The Merlin engine remained familiar territory for many British technicians. Replacement parts became increasingly available. Routine maintenance followed logical procedures. Pilots appreciated reliability. Mechanics appreciated accessibility. Together, those qualities increased operational readiness across entire squadrons. As weeks became months, victory claims steadily increased. More importantly, bomber losses began declining. Aircrews who had previously dreaded daylight missions noticed the difference. The escorts stayed beside them longer than ever before. Whenever German fighters appeared, silver Mustangs usually arrived first. Confidence spread through bomber formations just as rapidly as it had among fighter squadrons. The psychological balance of the air war slowly shifted. For years, German pilots had hunted. Now, increasingly, they found themselves being hunted instead. The Mustang had not ended the air war. It had changed its direction. And for the Royal Air Force pilots who had climbed into that unfamiliar American fighter for the very first time, one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. Their first impressions had been correct. This extraordinary aircraft was not simply another new fighter. It was becoming the machine that would accompany them through some of the most decisive battles of the Second World War. Part 3. By the spring of 1944, the Mustang was no longer an experiment. It had become a familiar sight above Europe. Silver fighters stretched across the sky alongside bomber formations, their polished fuselages reflecting sunlight thousands of feet above the battlefields below. German radar stations reported them almost daily. Luftwaffe commanders adjusted their plans again and again, but the reports kept arriving with the same frustrating conclusion. The escorts were still there. What had begun as cautious optimism among Royal Air Force pilots had evolved into complete confidence. The Mustang had earned its place. Mission briefings changed noticeably during those months. Instead of discussing how long escort fighters could remain with the bombers, commanders began discussing how aggressively they should use them. The difference was enormous. Previously, escort pilots had been forced to conserve fuel, avoid unnecessary engagements, and calculate every mile they flew. Now they could think offensively. Rather than waiting for German fighters to attack, Mustang squadrons often swept ahead of the bomber streams, searching for enemy aircraft before they reached their targets. Veteran pilots described the strategy as turning the hunter into the hunted. For the Luftwaffe, it created a problem unlike anything they had faced before. German pilots could no longer choose the time and place of every engagement. Sometimes they barely finished climbing from their own airfields before Mustangs appeared overhead. Factories, railway junctions, airfields, fuel depots. Every important location seemed protected by fighters that somehow possessed endless range. Many Luftwaffe veterans later admitted that the appearance of the Mustang forced them to rethink almost every combat tactic they had developed during the war. Several German fighter units reported increasing difficulty reaching Allied bombers because they first had to survive encounters with escort fighters. Even successful interceptions became costly. Every damaged aircraft, every experienced pilot lost. Every aborted mission weakened Germany's ability to defend its skies. Royal Air Force pilots noticed the change as well. Dogfights became less predictable. Instead of brief encounters near the limits of escort range, battles now unfolded across vast stretches of occupied Europe. A Mustang pilot might escort bombers across the English Channel, fight over northern France, pursue enemy fighters across Belgium, continue into Germany, and still possess enough fuel to return home safely. Only months earlier, such a mission would have seemed almost impossible. The aircraft had fundamentally expanded what fighter pilots believed could be accomplished in a single sortie. Its greatest strength was not simply speed. Nor was it firepower. Its true advantage came from combining every important quality into one remarkably balanced machine. It climbed well. It dived beautifully. It remained stable at tremendous speed. Its controls inspired confidence. Its Merlin engine delivered reliable power. Its fuel capacity changed the geography of air combat. Together, those characteristics created something rare. An aircraft with very few serious weaknesses. Of course, experienced pilots understood that no fighter was invincible. The Mustang could still be shot down. Mechanical failures still occurred. Weather remained an unpredictable enemy. Anti-aircraft fire continued claiming aircraft every week. Even the finest pilot could make one fatal mistake. Yet among those who flew it regularly, respect for the aircraft continued growing. Some remembered their first takeoff more vividly than their first combat victory. Others recalled returning from their initial flight, convinced they had just experienced the future of fighter aviation. One Royal Air Force officer later remarked that the Mustang gave pilots an unusual feeling. It made difficult missions seem possible. That confidence spread beyond fighter squadrons. Bomber crews began recognizing Mustang formations from a distance. Whenever they spotted the long-nosed fighters weaving above them, many crews admitted they felt noticeably calmer. They understood they were not alone anymore. The psychological effect worked both ways. German pilots increasingly found themselves scanning the skies for Mustangs before searching for bombers. One threat had quietly replaced another. As preparations accelerated for the Allied invasion of Western Europe, the Mustang became one of the most important tools in achieving air superiority. Escort missions blended with fighter sweeps, ground attacks, armed reconnaissance, airfield patrols. Every successful operation reduced Germany's ability to resist the coming invasion. Pilots who had once questioned the American fighter now competed for opportunities to fly it. Squadron records from the period consistently praised its endurance, reliability, and combat performance. While many airmen remained fiercely loyal to the Spitfire, few denied what the Mustang had accomplished. It had solved a problem that had haunted Allied air forces for years: distance. The skies above Europe no longer belonged only to the defenders. The attackers could now remain overhead almost as long as necessary. For many Royal Air Force veterans, memories of their first Mustang flight remained surprisingly personal. They rarely spoke first about statistics. They seldom mentioned maximum speed. They did not begin with horsepower or fuel capacity. Instead, they remembered emotions. The moment the wheels left the runway, the smooth pull of the Merlin engine, the effortless climb, the remarkable visibility beneath the bubble canopy, the strange realization that they were flying farther, faster, and with greater confidence than ever before. Those feelings stayed with them long after the war ended. Years later, reunions often brought former pilots together once again. Stories inevitably returned to familiar subjects: the Battle of Britain, night operations, lost friends, victories, close escapes, and eventually, someone would mention the Mustang. Smiles usually followed. Many veterans still described that first flight with almost childlike excitement. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented possibility. In the darkest years of the war, possibility had become one of the rarest commodities. The Mustang restored it. Modern aviation historians often debate which fighter deserves the title of the greatest aircraft of the Second World War. Some choose the Spitfire. Others favor the Messerschmitt, the Corsair, the Thunderbolt. Each possesses remarkable achievements. Yet whenever former Royal Air Force Mustang pilots explained why they admired the aircraft, their answers shared a common theme. It allowed them to do their job better. It carried them farther, protected them longer, brought more of them home. Perhaps that is the highest compliment any combat aircraft can receive. The P-51 Mustang was never loved simply because it was fast. It became legendary because pilots trusted it with their lives. That trust began during those very first flights over the English countryside. Long before the victories, before the headlines, before history recognized its importance. A handful of experienced Royal Air Force pilots climbed into an unfamiliar American fighter, expecting only another aircraft to evaluate. Instead, they discovered a machine that changed the balance of the air war. One flight at a time. One escort mission after another. One bomber formation safely returned after the next. When they landed after those first test flights, most of them struggled to describe exactly what they had experienced. Some spoke about the engine. Others praised the handling. Many simply smiled before climbing down from the cockpit. Because sometimes the most remarkable machines cannot be fully explained. They have to be flown. And for the Royal Air Force pilots who first took the controls of the American P-51 Mustang, that first flight became something they would remember for the rest of their lives.